Throughout Europe during the 1300s, populations fell and farms and villages were abandoned. In Scandinavia, particularly Norway, the situation was especially grim. The number of people fell by as much as half, and many lands were left depopulated, not to recover for centuries. The main reason for this devastation was the Black Death, the wave of bubonic plague that swept across Asia and Europe starting in the 1340s. But why were the losses so high in Scandinavia? Could there have been other forces at work? Well, since the mid-20th century, scholars have raised the possibility that climate, too, might have played a role. A large-scale study in the 1970s suggested links between the onset of the Little Ice Age and the abandonment of settlements in remote parts of Norway and Sweden. Later, researchers have examined connections between the coldest years of the Little Ice Age and Scandinavia's worst mortality crises. How bad was the Little Ice Age for people in the Nordic countries, and why? In this lesson, we'll examine negative impacts of a cooling climate. We'll consider some challenges of the Little Ice Age for pre-industrial societies and how they could turn difficult and deadly. As we saw in Lesson 1, global climate changes during the Little Ice Age were small compared to those of current man-made warming. Yet, for ordinary people of the past, what concerned them most wasn't so much global climate, but local weather. Small changes in average temperatures or sudden cooling after volcanic eruptions meant that some kinds of weather hazards could become much more frequent and much more severe. With global warming, we are getting used to more intense heat waves and rainstorms and droughts. In the Nordic countries, the Little Ice Age often meant longer winters, cooler summers, more flooding and severe frosts. Most people did not experience the Little Ice Age as a gradual change in temperature. Instead, they noticed the unusual weather, the extreme seasons, and weather-related hazards. However, natural hazards alone don't cause disasters. That is, physical destruction and loss of life. For natural hazards to cause disasters, we need two other factors. First, there must be populations exposed to the hazard, such as settlements built next to a flooding river. And second, the exposed populations must be vulnerable to the hazard. That is, they lack resources and adaptations to resist the hazard or escape without harm. The disastrous impacts of the Little Ice Age in the Nordic countries were as much about exposure and vulnerability as about climate and weather-related hazards. First, most people in late medieval and early modern times were farmers, and this exposed them to the hazard of cooling temperatures. Their lives and livelihoods depended on regular, predictable seasons for the planting, growing, and harvesting of their crops. In the Nordic countries, successful agriculture often depends on very slender margins. Even today, northern Scandinavia and Finland need warm summers for grains to have enough days to mature. During the coldest periods of the Little Ice Age, growing seasons were up to 6 weeks shorter. Early and late frosts were a constant threat to crops sprouting or ripening in the fields. Besides farming, many vital activities were affected by the cooling climate. Transportation and trade were affected when harbours and rivers froze for months on end. One of our best ways to reconstruct temperatures during the Little Ice Age is to look how long ports in the Baltic had to close every winter. Often, sheep and cattle couldn't get enough to graze during cool and rainy summers. The quantity and quality of their milk suffered, and if the snows came too early or thawed too late, animals could starve over long winters. Icelanders were particularly affected by heavy sea ice, which brought cold weather and made sailing dangerous. During the Little Ice Age, the ice sometimes lasted all through the summer and came even to the southern coast. Some of Iceland's worst famines came during times of heavy sea ice, such as the early 1600s, 1690s, and 1810s. Moreover, many people in late medieval and early times were vulnerable to climate change and weather-related hazards. Many factors contributed to this vulnerability. Poverty was widespread, and most people had few spare resources to see themselves through hard times. Following the catastrophic losses of the 1300s, population densities were low, especially in Finland, Iceland, and northern Scandinavia. Small communities had to be mostly self-reliant, and people affected by disasters might have to travel long distances to get help. As Nordic populations recovered, especially in the late 1500s and 1700s, growth brought new vulnerabilities. In some places, the best farmland was already used, and some farmers had to make a living on less fertile soils. Moreover, rising populations usually meant rising inequalities. Even as towns, merchants, nobility, and large landowners prospered in these times of growth, there was also a growing class of the poor and the landless. These were usually the first to suffer in times of disaster. Above all, populations in late medieval and early modern times were vulnerable to diseases. In late medieval Scandinavia, about half the population died before age 18, and those that made it to adulthood typically lived only into their 50s. Infections spread from contaminated food and water, worms, fleas and lice, coughing and sneezing. When disaster struck, diseases spread faster and turned more deadly. Hunger weakened immune systems and often forced vulnerable people to huddle together in unhygienic conditions. Poor people on the move in search of food and shelter were easy prey for infections such as dysentery and typhus. Animals, too, suffered from diseases related to the Little Ice Age. For example, outbreaks of rinderpest or cattle plague in the 1710s and 1740s followed two of Europe's coldest winters in the Little Ice Age, in 1709 and 1740. These devastated livestock, especially in Denmark, which was becoming an important cattle exporter. The combination of vulnerabilities can help us make sense of some of the worst disasters and loss of life during the Nordic Little Ice Age. For example, Finland suffered terrible famines during the first decade and again during the last decade of the 1600s. Both of the famines followed large volcanic eruptions, which each brought a few years of global cooling. In Finland, there were hardly enough warm days for crops to ripen in the fields, meaning that grains were very vulnerable to early frosts. And when those frosts came, harvests were ruined in parts of Finland, leaving farmers without food or income. Historical records reveal that during the early 1600s, many farmers had to abandon their farms. And during the 1690s, fewer farmers left their land, but they still had to travel in search of food. This triggered outbreaks of disease that killed up to 1/5 of the Finnish population. The Finnish famine of the 1690s was probably the worst famine of the Little Ice Age in the Nordic countries, but it was not the last. Famines and mortality triggered by exceptional cold would continue even into the 19th century. In the following lessons, we'll examine what it was like to live through these difficult times and how they influenced the political and social history of the Nordic countries. We'll also look at how Nordic societies responded to these challenges and escaped from the worst effects of the Little Ice Age.